Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so happy that you've decided to join me again for Reading Ritual. This is Reading Ritual with Miss Carmen. That's me. The reason I'm so happy that you decided to come back for the next chapters that we're reading is because while you and I are reading together and we're learning together and we're sharing together, the minutes that we spend on this project every time that we get together, we're going to log in those reading minutes and we get to put them into this website called SaveTheChildren.org reading program. And what we're doing is going to help them get some books and resources to children that don't have regular access, that they can't get books for some reason or another. And so it's a win, win, win. We're learning together, we're reading together, spending time together, and we're helping other children too. So thank you for coming back. And I don't know if everyone here is the same group, but for those of you that are joining us for the first time, let me give you a little bit of background. Currently, we are reading Stuart Little by E.B. White, and the pictures that you'll see are by Garth Williams. I'm really excited to share this book with you because this is still, after all these years, one of my favorite all-time books. And the reason it's such a favorite book is because when I was in second grade, my second grade teacher had a reading ritual for us too. Every afternoon after lunch, we would come in from the playground and she would read us all these incredible books. Now, she was originally from London and she was an actress. She had retired from the stage, but when she read to us, she acted out every single character in all of the books that she read for us. For me, that was my most magical time because I don't know if you all know this, but Spanish is actually my first language and English is my second language. So when I was in school, in kindergarten and first grade, and even part of second grade, I was really struggling in class because I didn't know the language. I didn't really know how to speak English. I didn't know how to read in English. And I couldn't really communicate with the other children in English. So that was a bit of a problem and a challenge. But because of Mrs. Swanet, who's one of my favorite teachers, I learned to love reading. And by reading, I learned to love words. And by learning to love words, I did much better in school. So that's one thing. The other thing that you probably should know about me, because it will probably happen while I'm reading to you now at this age, I sometimes when I'm reading, letters and numbers, mostly numbers, but letters and numbers sometimes get all jumbled up. So I stumble around a little bit and sometimes I get a little frustrated because I can't quite read exactly the words on the page. But when I was about your age, I had two little champions. They were my reading champions, and they were always with me when I was trying to learn to read. So I brought two new reading champions, and I'd like to introduce you to them. That's for everyone who hasn't met them in the first video that we did for the first three chapters that we read together. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Gus Duck and Susie May. They love all the same stories and all the same books that I do, so they've insisted on sitting over my shoulder facing you so that they can see you and you can see them. So maybe, just maybe, if you're having a little bit of trouble reading at school or reading at home, Maybe Gus Duck and Susie May might be able to motivate you and they'll be your champions, or you can find your own champions. That's what I used to do, and they always encouraged me to just keep going. Even though they never said a word, I always knew that they were encouraging me to keep going. So that's what we're going to do, all right? So, for all intents and purposes, we are going to have fun reading stories. We're helping other children get books and resources, and we're going to learn together and we're going to thrive together. So, without further ado, we are going to read Stuart Little, and we are starting where we left off. Here we go. Chapter 4, Exercise. One fine morning in the month of May, when Stuart was 3 years old, he arose early as was his custom, washed and dressed himself, took his hat and cane, and went downstairs into the living room to see what was going on. Nobody was around except Snowbell, the white cat who belonged to Mrs. Little. Snowbell was another early riser, and this morning he was lying on the rug in the middle of the room, thinking about the days when he was just a kitten. "Good morning," said Stuart. "Hello," replied Snowbell sharply. "You're up early, aren't you?" Stuart looked at his watch and said, "It's only 5 minutes past 6, but I felt good and I thought I'd come down and get a little exercise." "I should think you'd get all the exercise you want up there in the bathroom, banging around, waking all the rest of us up, trying to get that water started so you could brush your teeth. Your teeth aren't really big enough to brush anyway. Want to see a good set? Look at mine." Snowbell opened his mouth and showed 2 rows of gleaming white teeth, sharp as needles. So I'm going to show you a quick picture here. That's Snowbell showing Stuart his teeth. That might be a little scary for a little mouse, don't you think? "Very nice," said Stuart, "but mine are all right too, even though they're small. As for exercise, I take all I can get. I bet my stomach muscles are firmer than yours." "I bet they're not," said the cat. "I bet they are," said Stuart. "They're like iron bands." "I bet they're not," said the cat. Stuart glanced around the room to see what he could do to prove to Snowbell what good stomach muscles he had. He spied the drawn window shade on the east window with its shade cord and ring like a trapeze, and it gave him an idea. Climbing to the windowsill, he took off his hat and cane, and he said, "You can't do this." And he ran and jumped onto the ring the way acrobats do in a circus, and he meant to pull himself up. But a surprising thing happened. Stuart had taken such a hard jump that it started the shade. With a loud snap, the shade flew up clear to the top of the window, dragging Stuart along with it and rolling him up inside so that he couldn't budge. "Holy mackerel," said Snowbell, who was almost as surprised as Stuart Little. "I guess that'll teach him to show off his muscles." "Help! Let me out!" cried Stuart, who was frightened and bruised inside the rolled up shade. Let me show you real quick. That's what he was doing. That's what happened. That's how he got caught in the shade. He was kind of showing off a little bit. Let's see. He was frightened and bruised inside the rolled up shade, and he could hardly breathe. But his voice was so weak that nobody heard. Snowbell just chuckled. He was not fond of Stuart, and it didn't bother him at all that Stuart was all wrapped up in the window shade, crying and hurt and unable to get out. Instead of running upstairs and telling Mr. and Mrs. Little about the accident, Snowbell did a very curious thing. He glanced around to see if anybody was looking, and then he leapt softly up to the window sill, picked up Stuart's hat and cane in his mouth and carried them to the pantry and laid them down beside the entrance to that mouse hole. Now, if you remember in a previous chapter, the littles were very concerned about that mouse hole because they thought that Stuart might go down the mouse hole and get lost. That wasn't very nice of Snowbell, was it? When Mrs. Little came down later and found them there, she gave a shrill scream, which brought everyone downstairs on the run. "It's happened," she cried. "What has?" asked her husband. "Stuart's down the mouse hole." Now we're on chapter 5. But don't be scared. This chapter is called Rescued. George, now I think you probably remember who George is, right? But for those of you who just joined us, you'll probably have to go back to the first video so that you can see the other, or you can hear the other chapters that we read. But George is Stuart's older brother, so that's really important to keep that in mind, okay? George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have this old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a good, rigorous pry. "We will not rip up this floor till we've had a good search," announced Mr. Little. "And that's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "Oh, all right," said George. "I can see that nobody in this house cares anything about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. "My poor dear little son," she said. "I know he'll get wedged somewhere." "Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean it isn't perfectly suited for Stuart," said Mr. Little. Just don't get yourself all worked up." "Maybe we ought to lower some food to him," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave." George darted into the kitchen and came back with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in and it'll run down to where he is." George spooned out a bit of the applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. "Stop that!" bellowed Mr. Little. "George, will you kindly let me handle this situation? Put that applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was just trying to help my own brother," said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. "Let's all call Stuart," suggested Mrs. Little. "It's quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists and that he's lost his way." "Very well," said Mr. Little. "I will count to 3, and then we will all call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds listening for an answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. They all called, "Stuart!" And they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, "Here I am." But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside that shade that the other members of his family didn't hear him. "Again," said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3. "Stuart!" It was no use. No answer was heard. I'm going to show you a picture of the Littles right there. Can everyone see? Whoops, there we go. That's the whole family shouting for Stuart in the mouse hole. But when no answer was heard, Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom, laid down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau of Missing Persons. But when the man asked for a description of Stuart and he was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down to the cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance to the mouse hole. Well, that's a really good idea, don't you think? It seems like George really does want to help his little brother. George moved a great many trunks and suitcases and flower pots and baskets and boxes and broken chairs. That kind of sounds like my garage right now. Anyway, he moved them from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get to that area of the wall where he thought was the likeliest, but he found no mouse hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's, and becoming interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty, but spent the rest of the morning rowing. Now, if you remember, we already know that George, Stuart's older brother, gets easily distracted by other things when he's supposed to be focusing on something. So that doesn't surprise me. Does it surprise you? I didn't think so. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All three sat down to a lamb stew, which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal. Each one trying not to stare at the empty chair which Stuart always occupied right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat, so great was their sorrow. George ate a little bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again, and she said she thought that Stuart must be dead. Nonsense, nonsense, growled Mr. Little. If he is dead, said George, we ought to pull down the shades all through the house. And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. George, shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone, if you don't stop acting in such a silly fashion, I will have to punish you. We're having enough trouble today without having to cope with this foolishness. But George had already run into the living room and had begun to darken it to show his respect for the dead, for he presumed dead. He pulled a cord and out dropped Stuart onto the windowsill. Well, for the love of Pete, said George, look who's here, Mom. It's about time somebody pulled down that shade, remarked Stuart. That's all I can say. He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed. You can only imagine, right? Like a mom who thought that her son had gone down a mouse hole would be very worried. She was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it had happened. It was simply an accident that might happen to anybody, said Stuart. And as for my hat and cane being found at the entrance to the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions. It seems to me that perhaps Stuart didn't want to admit that he was being a bit of a show-off. Okay, we have got a few more minutes and we're going to go ahead and read chapter 6. All right, we've got a little time. So we're going to read through this and we'll see how far we can get. Okay, here goes. Chapter 6, A Fair Breeze. One morning, when the wind was from the west, Stuart put on his sailor suit and his sailor hat, took his spyglass down from the shelf, and set out for a walk, full of the joy of life and the fear of dogs. With a rolling gait, he sauntered along toward Fifth Avenue, keeping a sharp lookout. So there's Stuart on the fire hydrant, keeping a sharp lookout, and he is on Fifth Avenue in New York. So if you're watching and you're reading with us and you live in New York, who knows, maybe you should keep an eye out for Stuart Little. Whenever he spied a dog through his glass, Stuart would hurry to the nearest doorman, climb his trouser leg, and hide in the tails of his uniform. And once, when no doorman was handy, he had to crawl into a yesterday's paper and roll himself up in the second section till danger was past. At the corner of Fifth Avenue, there were several people waiting for the uptown bus, and Stuart joined them. Nobody noticed him because he wasn't tall enough to be noticed. I'm not tall enough to be noticed, thought Stuart, yet I'm tall enough to want to go to 72nd Street. When the bus came into view, all the men waved their canes. All the men waved their canes and briefcases at the driver, and Stuart waved his spyglass. Then, knowing that the step of the bus was too high for him, Stuart seized hold of the cuff of a gentleman's pants and was swung aboard without any trouble or inconvenience whatsoever. So I don't know if you can see, but there he is, Stuart, right there on that pant leg, about to board the bus, and the back of the man's pant right above that shoe. Can you see him? Stuart never paid any fare on buses because he wasn't big enough to carry an ordinary dime. The only time he had ever attempted to carry a dime, he had rolled the coin along like a hoop while he raced along beside it. But it had gotten away from him on a hill and had been snatched up by an old woman with no teeth. After that experience, Stuart contented himself with the tiny coins which his father made for him out of tinfoil. They were very handsome little things, although rather hard to see without putting on your spectacles. So if I took my glasses off, I wouldn't be able to see them because they were so small. When the conductor came around to collect the fares on the bus, Stuart fished in his purse, pulled out a coin no bigger than the eye of a grasshopper. "What's that you're offering me?" asked the conductor. "It's one of my dimes," said Stuart. "Is it now?" said the conductor. "Well, I'd have a fine time explaining that to the bus company. Why, you're no bigger than a dime yourself." "Yes, I am," replied Stuart angrily. "I'm more than twice as big as a dime. A dime only comes up to here on me," and Stuart pointed to his hip. "Furthermore," he added, "I didn't come on this bus to be insulted." "I beg pardon," said the conductor. "You'll have to forgive me, for I had no idea in all the world there was such a small sailor." "Live and learn," muttered Stuart tartly, putting his change purse back in his pocket. When the bus stopped at 72nd Street, Stuart jumped out and hurried across to the sailboat pond in Central Park. Over the pond the west wind blew, and into the teeth of the west wind sailed the sloops and schooners, their rails well down, their wet decks gleaming. The owners, boys and grown men, raced around the cement shores, hoping to arrive at the other side in time to keep the boats from bumping each other. Some of the toy boats were not as small as you might think, for when you got close to them, you found that their main mast was taller than a man's head, and they were beautifully made, with everything ship-shape and ready for sea. To Stuart, they seemed enormous, and he hoped he would be able to get aboard one of them and sail away to the far corners of the pond. He was an adventurous little fellow, and he loved the feel of the breeze in his face and the cry of the gulls overhead and the heave of the great swell under him. Okay, I'm going to show you these photos now. There's the boat pond, and there is Stuart looking across the pond. Doesn't he look handsome in that sailor suit with his little tail behind him? As Stuart sat cross-legged on the wall that surrounds the pond, gazing out at the ships through his spyglass, Stuart noticed one boat that seemed to him finer and prouder than any other. Her name was Wasp, and she was big, black, and she was flying the American flag. She was a beautiful schooner. She had a clipper bow, and on her foredeck was a mounted 3-inch cannon. She's the ship for me, thought Stuart, and the next time she sailed in, he ran over to where she was being turned around. Excuse me, sir, said Stuart to the man who was turning her, but are you the owner of the schooner Wasp? I am, replied the man, surprised to be addressed by a mouse in a sailor's suit. I'm looking for a berth in a good ship, continued Stuart, and I thought perhaps you might sign me on. I'm strong and I'm quick. Are you sober? Asked the owner of the Wasp. I do my work, said Stuart crisply. The man looked sharply at him. He couldn't help admiring the trim appearance and the bold manner of this diminutive, seafaring character. Well, he said at length, pointing to the prow of the Wasp out toward the center of the pond, tell you what I'll do with you. You see that big racing sloop out there? I do, said Stuart. That's the Lillian B. Womrath, said the man, and I dislike her with all my heart. Then so do I, said Stuart loyally. I dislike her because she's always bumping into my boat, continued the man, and because her owner is a lazy boy who doesn't understand sailing and who hardly knows a squall from a squid. Or a jib from a jibe, cried Stuart. Or a luff from a leech, bellowed the man. Or a deck from a dock, screamed Stuart. Or a mast from a mist. Wait, yelled the man. But hold on. No more of this. I'll tell you what we'll do. The Lillian B. Womrath has always been able to beat the Wasp sailing, but I believe that if my schooner were properly handled, it would be a different story. Nobody knows how I suffer standing here on the shore, helpless, watching the Wasp blunder along, when all she needs is a steady hand on her helm. So, my young friend, I will let you sail the Wasp across the pond and back, and if you can beat that detestable sloop, I'll give you a regular job. Aye, aye, sir, said Stuart, swinging himself aboard the schooner and taking his place at the wheel. Ready about. One moment, said the man. Do you mind telling me how you propose to beat the other boat? I intend to crack on more sail, said Stuart. Not in my boat, thank you, replied the man quickly. I don't want you capsizing in a squall. Well then, said Stuart, I'll catch the sloop, broad on, and rake her with fire from my forward gun. Foul means, said the man. I want this to be a boat race, and a fair one, not a naval engagement. Well then, said Stuart cheerfully, I'll sail the Wasp straight and true and let the Lillian B. Womrath go yawing all over the pond. Bravo, cried the man, and good luck go with you. And so saying, he let go of the Wasp prow. A puff of air bellied out of the schooner's headsails, and she paid off and filled away on the port tack, heeling gracefully over the breeze, while Stuart twirled her wheel and braced himself against a deck cleat. By the by, yelled the man, you haven't told me your name. Name is Stuart Little, called Stuart at the top of his lungs. I'm the second son of Frederick C. Little of this city. Bon voyage, Stuart, hollered his friend. Take care of yourself and bring the Wasp home safe. That I will, shouted Stuart, and he was so proud and happy he let go of the wheel for a second and did a little dance on the sloping deck, never noticing how narrowly he escaped hitting a tramp steamer that was drifting in his path with her engines disabled and her decks awash. Oh boy. Okay, that's where we're going to end today. That's about 30 minutes. So we're going to call it a day and we're going to start with chapter 7 next time we get together. Thank you for joining me today on Reading Ritual with Miss Carmen. We're doing really good work here by helping other children have access to books and resources. I'm going to log on to that website and put in our reading minutes, and it's all going to add up. So I'll see you next time for day 3 and chapter 7 of Stuart Little by E.B. White. Talk to you soon. Have a great, great rest of your time, day or evening, whenever you're watching this. And don't forget to put some comments or have your parents put some comments in the post below. They'll get more information and I'll try to respond to everyone. Bye, everybody. Talk to you soon and keep reading.